In 1812, Napoleon Bonaparte looked at a map of Russia and thought, yeah, I could take that. This is the story of how that thought destroyed the largest army Europe had ever assembled. Not defeated in one battle, not crushed by a genius general, mostly just frozen and starved and humiliated by geography itself. Napoleon, I will conquer Russia in 20 days. Russia, okay? Narrator, Russia did not fight back the way anyone expected. Russia just left. Let's back up for a second, because to understand how unbelievable this failure was, you need to understand how unbelievable Napoleon's success had been up to this point. This is a man who started as a mid-level artillery officer from a minor noble family on the island of Corsica, and within about 15 years crowned himself Emperor of France. Not was crowned himself. He literally took the crown out of the Pope's hands during his own coronation and put it on his own head. On camera, well, not on camera, this was 1804, but you get the idea. Napoleon, thanks for coming, Pope, I've got this part. By the time we reach 1812, Napoleon had defeated Austria, defeated Prussia, defeated most coalitions Europe could throw at him, and generally behaved like a man who had never once lost an argument in his life. So when he decided Russia needed to be taught a lesson, nobody in his inner circle was exactly in a position to say, hey, maybe don't. By 1812, Napoleon controlled almost the entirety of continental Europe. Spain obedient, Germany obedient, Italy obedient. Only Britain kept refusing to admit he'd won, mostly because Britain was an island and Napoleon's navy had the tactical sophistication of a bathtub toy. So Napoleon did what any reasonable emperor does when one country won't listen. He tried to starve an entire continent into agreeing with him. It was called the Continental System. No European nation was allowed to trade with Britain. Napoleon, this will bring Britain to its knees. Britain, still trading with literally everyone else on Earth. Cool story. There was one small problem. Russia got bored of this plan and started trading with Britain anyway. Napoleon took that personally. Tsar Alexander I of Russia had technically agreed to the continental system a few years earlier, as part of a treaty where he and Napoleon were, briefly, on suspiciously friendly terms. Napoleon and Alexander had literally met on a raft in the middle of a river to sign that treaty, which is either extremely romantic or extremely suspicious, depending on how you like your diplomacy. Tsar Alexander were basically best friends now. Napoleon, yes. Russian grain exports to Britain, however, were simply too profitable to give up. Russian nobles depended on that trade, so Alexander quietly let it keep happening. Napoleon found out. Napoleon did not love finding out, and so, in the grand tradition of powerful men who feel personally disrespected, Napoleon decided the correct response to my friend is ignoring my economic policy was I will now personally walk to Moscow with 600,000 men. So in the summer of 1812, he assembled the largest invasion force in European history to that point, somewhere around 600,000 men, soldiers from France, Poland, Austria, Prussia, Italy, and a rotating cast of nations that had been conquered so recently they hadn't finished unpacking. Napoleon, we cross the border, we win one decisive battle, Russia surrenders. Everyone in this video already knows this is not what happens. It's also worth pointing out that this 600,000-man army was not, technically, a French army. It was more of a European group project where only one country actually wanted to be there. Roughly half the Grande Armée was made up of soldiers from countries Napoleon had already conquered, Poles, Italians, Germans, Austrians, Dutch, and more, many of whom had, at best, a lukewarm interest in freezing to death for the glory of France. Polish soldier, I'm just here because my country got annexed. Napoleon, excellent, march faster. This mattered later. An army held together mostly by conquest and obligation, rather than loyalty, tends to fall apart a lot faster once things go badly. And things were about to go very, very badly. The Grande Armée crossed into Russian territory in June, expecting the kind of glorious clash Napoleon had built his entire career on. Instead, the Russian army did something deeply annoying to a man who loved winning battles. They simply refused to show up. Russian general, we could fight him. Also Russian general, or we could just walk backward for several hundred miles and let the country itself do the fighting for us. This strategy is now called scorched earth, and it is exactly as pleasant as it sounds. As the Russian army retreated, they burned crops, burned villages, poisoned wells, took the livestock, left absolutely nothing behind for an invading army of 600,000 hungry men to eat. Napoleon's soldiers marched deeper and deeper into Russia, chasing an army that would not stop retreating, through a landscape that had then been deliberately emptied of anything resembling food. Napoleon, surely they'll fight soon. Russia, nope. Napoleon, surely not, they'll fight. Russia, still no. By the time the two armies actually collided, at a town called Borodino, Napoleon's force had already shrunk dramatically. Not from combat, from starvation, disease, and desertion. Borodino remains one of the single bloodiest days in the history of warfare up to that point. Tens of thousands of casualties on each side in less than 24 hours. Cannons roared continuously for hours. Entire regiments were wiped out, advancing across open fields into artillery fire, over and over, in the exact style of warfare that would later make World War I historians wince in recognition. Napoleon, watching the carnage from a hill, reportedly hesitated to commit his elite Imperial Guard reserve, the single most feared unit in his entire army, worried about losing them so far from home. Napoleon's marshal, send in the guard, we could end this. Napoleon, and if it goes wrong, I'm 2,000 kilometers from Paris with no backup plan. It was, arguably, the first moment the invincible emperor started playing not to lose instead of playing to win. And it showed. Napoleon technically won. The Russian army withdrew. But technically won is doing an enormous amount of work in that sentence, because the road to Moscow was now open and Napoleon marched his exhausted, half-starved army straight into the Russian capital, expecting the Tsar to finally surrender. Napoleon, I am in your capital. Russia, okay, 1 second. Russia then set Moscow on fire. Napoleon sat in a burning city, waiting for a peace offer that was never, ever going to come. Napoleon, alone in a smoking palace, this is fine. Weeks passed. No surrender arrived. Winter was arriving instead, and it does not send invitations. Napoleon finally gave the order every military historian has been waiting the entire video for. Napoleon, okay, we're leaving. This retreat from Moscow back toward friendly territory is the part of the story where things stop being merely bad and start becoming one of the worst military disasters in recorded history. The same scorched earth strategy that emptied Russia on the way in was still, in effect, on the way out. There was still no food. There were still no supplies, and now there was also snow. Temperatures dropped to -30, -40 degrees Celsius. Soldiers froze to death standing upright in formation. Horses died by the thousands, which meant the artillery had to be abandoned, which meant the supply wagons had to be abandoned, which meant there was even less food for everyone still alive. French soldier, I've lost feeling in my hands. Also French soldier, I've lost feeling in my entire concept of home. Cossack cavalry harassed the retreating column constantly, picking off stragglers who fell behind in the snow. Disease moved through the freezing, starving column just as efficiently as the cold did. Typhus, spread by lice in filthy uniforms, nobody had been able to wash or change in months. Killed soldiers by the tens of thousands, arguably more effectively than any Russian soldier managed to. By the time the army reached the Berezina River, it wasn't really an army anymore. It was a freezing, starving, disease-ridden crowd of survivors trying to outrun a Russian force closing in from multiple directions at once. Crossing the Berezina River became its own catastrophe as the army attempted to funnel across improvised bridges while under attack, in freezing water, in the middle of winter. French engineers built the bridges standing waist, deep in the freezing river itself, working in shifts, knowing most of them would not survive the exposure. Many of them didn't. Thousands of soldiers and camp followers drowned or were crushed in the panic to cross before the bridges were destroyed behind them. The word Berezina is still used in French today as slang for a total, humiliating catastrophe. That's how bad it was. It became a permanent part of the language. Of the roughly 600,000 men who marched into Russia that summer, only a small fraction made it back out. Historical estimates vary, but most place total losses, dead, captured, or missing, somewhere between 400,000 and 500,000 men. The largest army Europe had ever assembled effectively ceased to exist, not primarily from Russian bullets, from Russian weather, Russian distance, and a strategy that simply refused to give Napoleon the one thing he actually needed. A fight. He wasn't even there to see most of it, by the way. As the retreat collapsed into total chaos, Napoleon left the army behind, hopped in a sleigh, and raced back to Paris ahead of everyone to make sure nobody tried to seize power while he was gone. Napoleon, I need to abandon my army to protect my throne from the consequences of abandoning my army. Command of the shattered remains was left to his marshals, who had the extremely fun job of explaining to the survivors why the emperor wasn't there anymore. Napoleon arriving home with a fraction of his army. In my defense, it was a bit cold. The invasion of Russia is widely considered the single most catastrophic turning point of Napoleon's entire military career. His reputation as an unbeatable strategic genius, built over a decade of victories, evaporated in a single winter. Contemporary accounts describe roads littered for hundreds of miles with abandoned cannons, frozen bodies, and soldiers so desperate they burned their own regimental flags for warmth, the exact symbols they had marched into Russia proudly carrying. One French officer later wrote that men would sit down in the snow to rest for just a moment and simply never get back up, frozen where they sat, sometimes still holding their muskets. It's the kind of detail that doesn't really fit into a joke, and that's sort of the point. Behind every one of these punchlines about frozen soldiers and bad decisions is the fact that hundreds of thousands of actual people, most of whom never particularly wanted to be there in the first place, did not survive this campaign. Within 2 years, the coalition of European powers he had spent his career dominating turned on him completely. Paris fell. Napoleon was exiled to the island of Elba. He would famously escape, return to power for about 100 days, and then lose again, permanently this time, at a small town in Belgium called Waterloo. But the seeds of that final collapse were planted in the Russian snow, an empire that looked unstoppable on a map undone by geography, distance, and an enemy that understood something Napoleon never fully accepted. Sometimes the winning move is to simply not play the game the way your opponent wants you to. Napoleon wanted one glorious battle that would end the war in a single afternoon. Russia gave him 1,800 miles of empty road and let the winter finish the job. Historians have argued for 2 centuries about exactly how much of this was deliberate Russian strategy versus how much was just Russia being enormous and cold, which, to be fair, it was already doing before Napoleon showed up. Either way, the phrase General Winter was born from this campaign. The idea that Russia's greatest military asset isn't a person at all, it's the weather itself, and it has never lost a war it decided to fight. It's a phrase that would come back, almost word for word, over a century later, when a different European army made an almost identical mistake by invading Russia in the middle of the 20th century and running directly into the exact same wall of distance, cold and scorched earth. Napoleon, surely no one will ever try this again. History, hold my beer. Narrator, and that, somehow, is how you defeat one of history's greatest military minds. Not with a better army, with a longer walk.